They were born in chains or dragged into them by war, forced to live as property in a world built to keep them silent and invisible. No land, no name, no rights, just obedience. But what happens when a man who has nothing is handed a sword? What happens when a slave decides to fight, not just to survive, but to rise? In the bloody, chaotic centuries of the Middle Ages, power came through violence. Armies clashed in mud and fire, and warriors became legends. For a slave, that world seemed unreachable. A realm built for lords and nobles, not for those shackled by birth. Still, some tried to break through, tried to carve a place for themselves in blood and steel. This is the untold story of those who tried to fight their way out of bondage, and why, almost every time, the system slammed the door shut in their face. Number 1. Slaves in the medieval world. Life for a medieval slave wasn't just hard, it was deliberately dehumanizing. Unlike serfs who were poor but still technically recognized as people with ties to the land and some degree of legal status, slaves were considered nothing more than movable property. They could be bought, sold, traded, inherited, or punished without legal consequence. A slave had no official name in the eyes of the law, no rights to their own family, and no ability to testify or appeal. They couldn't own land, couldn't refuse work, and couldn't escape without risking brutal punishment or death. In many cases, they couldn't even marry unless their owner permitted it, and if children were born, they were automatically property too. Another generation locked in the same chain. Most of these slaves ended up in this position through violence. Raids across Eastern Europe, the Mediterranean coast, the British Isles, and deep into Africa brought in a steady supply of human captives. Vikings made a business out of selling people they captured during their raids. Muslim and Christian powers alike fueled the trade, often capturing civilians during border conflicts or internal wars. These individuals were then sold into cities, estates, or courts where they worked endlessly for others' gain. Some were forced to till land, others labored in mines or galleys, while many worked inside wealthy households. In rare cases, slaves served as musicians, cooks, or concubines, but regardless of their role, they were never seen as equals. The idea that a slave might one day fight as a soldier was borderline absurd in most medieval cultures. Being a soldier meant more than swinging a sword. It meant you were trusted. You were expected to protect, not rebel. Giving a weapon to a slave meant handing power to someone who had every reason to use it against the very people who oppressed them. And in a society obsessed with lineage, birthright, and loyalty to lords and kings, slaves were outside the entire structure. They didn't swear oaths. They weren't baptized warriors. They had no coat of arms, no honor to defend, at least not in the way a feudal society defined it. Even during moments of crisis, when armies were desperate for manpower, slaves were rarely the first choice. Hiring mercenaries, recruiting peasants, or arming townsfolk made more sense because at least they were recognized as members of society. Slaves were simply not trusted. The ruling class feared what might happen if even a few of them gained skill, confidence, and followers. It wasn't about merit, it was about control. And keeping slaves away from the battlefield was just another way to keep them powerless. Number 2. Mamluks and the exception to the rule. In a medieval world where slaves were typically silenced and kept far from positions of power, the Mamluks stood out as a striking exception, an anomaly that defied the rules of status, power, and social mobility. These were not ordinary soldiers, and their origin as slaves did not prevent them from shaping empires. But their story wasn't one of generosity or justice. It was a calculated system of control that accidentally created one of the most powerful military classes of the Middle Ages. The Mamluks began their journey not as men, but as boys, foreign-born, non-Muslim children, often captured or bought in the chaotic borderlands of the Islamic world. The most common sources were the Caucasus, Central Asia, and occasionally Eastern Europe. These boys were torn from their families, stripped of identity, and placed in a rigorous, closed-off environment where they were converted to Islam and reshaped into instruments of war. Unlike typical slaves, they weren't thrown into fields or kitchens. Instead, they were given armor, horses, and advanced training in everything from archery to military tactics and Islamic jurisprudence. They were raised inside a brotherhood of discipline, obedience, and military excellence, all under the watchful eye of their patrons, sultans and emirs who expected loyalty without question. What made this system so unique was the psychological foundation behind it. The idea was that a slave with no roots, no local family, no tribal allegiance, no property, would have no distractions. He would owe everything to his master and, by extension, to the state. The result was a tightly knit warrior class whose loyalty was absolute, until it wasn't. By the 13th century, this same class of trained slaves, now grown into battle-hardened commanders, turned their strength inward. In Egypt, the Mamluks overthrew the Ayyubid dynasty and seized control of the state. They weren't just taking power, they were establishing an entirely new ruling system. The Mamluk Sultanate was born from blood, ambition, and deep internal unity. It was a military state run by former slaves who knew how to lead armies because they had spent their entire lives inside one. But this story shouldn't be seen as a model or even a repeatable success. The Mamluk system worked because it was a rigid, institutionalized machine backed by imperial wealth and ideology. It didn't offer freedom to all slave soldiers. It created a closed elite with its own rules. Most slaves in the medieval world never saw a training yard, let alone a battlefield. The Mamluks were the exception, not the possibility. Number 3. Europe's fear of armed slaves. In medieval Europe, where the social order was not only rigid but deeply sacred in the minds of the ruling class, the thought of handing a weapon to a slave wasn't just unsettling, it was dangerous. The entire feudal hierarchy was built on clear divisions. Kings ruled over nobles, nobles over knights, knights over peasants, and somewhere beneath even that, in the shadows of society, stood the slaves. These individuals weren't part of the kingdom's structure. They weren't bound to land like serfs or taxed like commoners. They were property. And in a world where honor and bloodlines determined a man's place, the idea of a slave standing in a soldier's role, wielding the same sword as a noble knight, was deeply subversive. To the European noble class, arming slaves threatened the very logic of feudalism. Knights were not just fighters, they were symbols of divine order, trained from youth in chivalry, loyalty, and the rituals of war. Their right to fight was framed as a spiritual and noble duty, granted by both their birth and the church. That same church taught that war, especially wars waged in defense of Christendom, was the work of the righteous. A slave, especially one who wasn't baptized or didn't come from a recognized Christian heritage, simply couldn't be entrusted with that role without corrupting the whole idea. To allow someone so lowly and disconnected from the sacred order to fight would be to admit that status might not be permanent, and that was unacceptable. Even when Europe was under siege, whether by outside invaders, peasant uprisings, or catastrophic wars, nobles hesitated to include slaves in the ranks. Only under the most dire circumstances, when castles were crumbling or cities on the brink of collapse, were slaves hastily given arms. And even then, their role was limited, closely watched, and never honored. Once the immediate threat had passed, these impromptu fighters were disarmed, dismissed, or worse, punished for their involvement. Slaves who showed courage or military talent weren't rewarded with freedom. They were seen as dangerous anomalies. A brave slave might inspire others. He might begin to believe he deserved more than chains. In the eyes of those in power, that kind of thinking had to be extinguished quickly. Allowing even one slave to rise through valor risked cracking the foundation of the entire system. So Europe's message was clear. You may die with a sword in your hand, but you will never live with one by your right. Number 4. False hopes and military utility. Throughout medieval history, there were fleeting moments when slaves were dangled the illusion of freedom in exchange for bloodshed. In the heat of battle, especially during prolonged wars or desperate defenses, commanders would sometimes promise liberation to those willing to fight. Take up arms, they'd say, and earn your place among the free. But these words, more often than not, were tools of manipulation, not sincere pledges. They were spoken not from respect or recognition, but from necessity, uttered in times when every body that could carry a spear or hold a shield became a resource, no matter their background or legal status. Slaves, already stripped of identity and agency,